Do countries become more liberal as they become wealthier? This is an interesting, basic question of political science, of political philosophy, of institutional evolution. And it's something that has intrigued students of these disciplines for a long time. In the West, meaning Western Europe and the United States and Canada, the countries of North America, the two seem to go together, wealth and liberalism. And here I have to point out that by liberalism I mean the classical definition of liberalism. That is, greater freedoms for individuals. Liberal meaning liberate, liberating people from the heavy hand of the state. So 18th and 19th century liberals in places like England wanted smaller government, and this is to distinguish it from modern liberalism, say in the United States, where modern American liberals often like bigger government. But liberals in the 19th century, they wanted smaller government. They wanted to free the individual, liberate the individual from the heavy hand of the state. So, when I say, and when political theorists talk about liberalism as liberalism, this is what they're talking about. So, greater freedoms, more democracy. In fact, you could say that democracy becomes almost a synonym for liberalism. So, if I rephrase the question, as countries become richer, do they become more democratic? Or I could even put it a little bit differently than that. As countries become more capitalistic, do they become more democratic? And I have a reason for putting it that way. Because in the United States, there are two institutions and associated value systems that characterize American society and have for over 100 years. And these are capitalism and democracy. It's worth noting, especially for our purposes today, that the United States was not born capitalist and it was not born a democracy. But it became a capitalistic economy and it became a democratic political system. So capitalism is the way one organizes an economy, and it's based on private ownership of property and what economists call the means of production. Industrial factories, mines, farms, and so on. The things that make other stuff and employ people. Are those in private hands? The alternative is that they could be in the hands of the state. That would be a socialist system. But a capitalist system has private property, so the means of production are in private hands, and the economy is organized around market principles. So there isn't a regulatory agency. The state doesn't just say, okay, you produce this much, you produce that much, these are the prices. No, the prices are set by markets and people produce as much as they can produce in response to these market signals, these prices. Okay, so that's capitalism. Democracy, a political system in which ordinary people exercise political power. Democracy is a subset of republicanism with a small r. A republic is a political system in which political legitimacy is based on the people. But it can be kind of fuzzy as to exactly how political power is exercised. So the United States was born a republic in 1776, when Americans broke away from the monarchy of Great Britain. And in its early days, republics usually were these things that were separate from monarchies. The United States became a democracy in the 19th century. Or, to put a pair of bounds on it, in 1800, the United States was did not have a capitalist economy. It was a pre-capitalist economy, and it did not have a democratic political system. In 1800, the United States was not capitalistic, and it wasn't democratic. By 1900, the United States was both capitalist and democratic. So, in American history, these two systems, they evolved not exactly simultaneously, but in tandem. If you look at it in the United States, actually democracy came a bit earlier than capitalism, at least in the modern kind of industrial and then finance capitalism. But there was this tandem evolution of the two. So, it's a reasonable question when Americans look out at the world and they look at countries, when they have looked at countries that were not democratic nor capitalistic, did Americans see the evolution of countries in the direction of these two systems? And I'd have to say that nearly every American leader of importance, certainly every president, has believed that democracy is good as a way of organizing people politically, and that capitalism is good as a way of organizing economies. Now, this is not surprising. The presidents of the United States are the sort of the embodiment, the exemplars of the American system, and the American system is based on capitalism and democracy. And Americans have often thought, not just presidents, but Americans have often thought that what works in the United States ought to work elsewhere. And this is the way people often operate. My value system works for me, so it'll probably work for you. Americans have at times tried to export their institutions, their systems. Sometimes they've let simply the example of the systems take hold and see if they take root and they flourish. But as Americans looked at other parts of the world, they often thought that the world would be a more peaceful place if other countries looked like the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, political scientists have developed what they call the theory of the democratic peace. And they've observed that democracies tend not to go to war against each other, whereas monarchies, autocracies go to war against each other more often. This isn't too surprising if you think about the mechanism by which decisions are made. A king can say to his subjects, you guys go to war. The king doesn't risk his life in doing that. He just tells other people to go. But in democracies, to the extent that the decisions are actually democratically made, the people who are deciding for war are the people who are actually going to go to war themselves, or maybe their kids are, or people who are very close to them. So there's a closer connection between the people who actually fight and the people who make the decisions. And under those circumstances, it wouldn't be surprising if democratic countries tended to be more peaceful. Americans have often thought, too, that countries that were more capitalistic, that were more open to trade, that were more free market oriented, would be more peaceful as well. And I've talked about this as well in previous lectures, the idea that where goods cross borders, soldiers don't. Countries that are each other's best customers and best suppliers tend not to be countries you want to go to war with, because if you want to buy products that are made in that country over there, don't go to war with that country, because the flow of products that you want is going to be disrupted. So it hasn't been outlandish for American leaders to think that if more of the world looks like the United States, the world will be more peaceful, and that will be good for the United States. They've also taken this position on grounds that it would be good for those other countries. Again, Americans tend to extrapolate from their own value systems, as most people do. So democracy and capitalism have worked pretty well for the United States, and so they ought to presumably work for other countries. And when I say work well for the United States, for all of the flaws of American democracy, for all of the inequalities that are built into American capitalism, from a world history standpoint, if you look at the history of the United States, you'd have to say it's been overall a rip-roaring success. From this inconsequential group of colonies just broken away from the British Empire in the latter part of the 18th century, in the 1770s and 1780s. The United States in 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, was not a country that anybody was paying attention to. It was not a country that wasn't particularly prosperous, and it certainly wasn't powerful by, well, the period that we've been dealing with in this course, the second half of the 20th century. The United States was the wealthiest, most powerful country on earth. So something must be working right in American history. Anyway, so that's the background for this question. As countries get wealthier, do they become more democratic? In the American history, you could turn it around. As countries get more democratic, do they become wealthier? And maybe there too. Or maybe I should just say, do the two systems evolve together? Now, this has been of particular interest to Americans in American leaders, American foreign policy makers, in the second half of the 20th century. Because the United States has been dealing with countries that don't always share American values. Now, the members of the American alliance system, countries like Britain, the British were democratic, and, well, in the Cold War period, they were often kind of socialistic. So the British have a greater tolerance for government intervention in the economy than Americans do. So in the 1940s and 1950s, the British had nationalized major industries, the coal industry, the steel industry. The British nationalized healthcare. Now, in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, the British backed away from nationalization of the coal mines and the steel industry, and they privatized a lot of stuff. They didn't privatize the National Health Service. And the British remain socialist in the delivery of healthcare. And the British, over the years, have been very attached to the National Health Service. So that's probably not going to be privatized. Anyway, France, democratic and largely capitalist. The Scandinavian countries, Norway, Norway in particular, who became part of NATO, Canada looks a lot like the United States. So the countries that were in the American alliance system were often countries that looked pretty much like the United States in terms of their embrace of capitalism, often not as enthusiastically embracing as the United States did, but certainly of democracy. Other countries have been democratic. And again, Americans have tended to think that democratic capitalist countries make the best allies. But Americans looked to other parts of the world and hoped other parts of the world that weren't currently democratic or capitalist would become like the United States. They would look in places like the decolonizing parts of Africa and Asia, when Americans, for example, looked at India. India was the second most populous, is the second most populous nation in the world. And it was a democracy from its birth in 1947. It's been kind of a hectic democracy, at times chaotic democracy, but it has tended towards socialism, oftentimes. And American leaders have wondered, could India be kind of nudged in the direction of capitalism? And the thinking here was, it would be good for India. India has been, for a long time, been plagued by large swaths of poverty. And Americans have often thought, again with some reason, that socialism tends to underperform capitalism in terms of delivering the economic goods. Now, there's a trade-off in that socialist economies tend to be more egalitarian. There aren't the great disparities between wealth and poverty that one sees in capitalist countries. Americans, as a group, have had a greater tolerance for these inequalities than some other countries do. But anyway, when Americans look at the world and they say, would India evolve to look more like the United States? It would be good if India did, and especially the socialism in India was something that made India seem, well, in the 1950s and 1960s to be kind of worryingly open to Soviet influence. And the Indians, the Indian government, made a point of making clear that they weren't going to fall into America's orbit, and so they would balance American aid with aid from the Soviet Union. But the big country that raised these questions in American thinking was China, and is China. So would China become more democratic, that is, more liberal in the classic sense, as it became wealthier? This has been the principal issue that American leaders have dealt with regarding China since the 1970s. That actually started before then. I discussed, when I was talking about détente, how Richard Nixon, starting in the 1960s and continuing in the 1970s, hatched the idea that the United States might try to peel China away from the Soviet Union even more than China had already distanced itself from the Soviet Union by opening normal relations with China. This was a big step, not least for Richard Nixon, because for 20 years after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the United States did not extend diplomatic recognition to China. So the United States could not have normal relations with China. The United States still took the position that the government on Taiwan was the real government of China, and this thing on the mainland, most of China, historical China, was this sort of fiction, was this outlaw country. Nixon changed that by going to China in 1972. The United States did not immediately establish normal diplomatic relations with China, did not extend full diplomatic relations to China until the late 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president. And most of the reason for the delay was the United States had to figure out how to finesse its relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan had been an ally of the United States. The United States had supported Taiwan during the 1950s and 1960s. The United States had given security guarantees to Taiwan. And the people living in Taiwan did not want to be part of China. China claimed authority over Taiwan but did not exercise authority over Taiwan. The Taiwanese said, forget it. You're not going to exercise authority over us. For a while, Taiwan maintained its position that Taiwan actually was the legitimate authority over China. But the government of Taiwan eventually gave that up. And during the time, the United States came up with this fuzzy formula. The United States, working with China, came up with this fuzzy formula that the United States would recognize China, so open official diplomatic relations with China in 1979, without giving up America's unique connection to Taiwan, and without somehow disputing exactly China's claim to Taiwan. It was one of those aspects of diplomacy where much was left unsaid. And the thinking was that time will make easier a resolution of this question. So between 1972 and 1979, the United States went from just the President of the United States visiting and talking directly to the leaders of China to 1979, the United States formally recognizing China as the government of the Chinese people. In between those 2 years, something crucial happened in China. Mao Zedong, the historic revolutionary leader of China, died, and he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping had been a good communist during the Mao era. If you wanted to stay in the Chinese government during the Mao era, you had to be a good communist and say all the right things. But Deng Xiaoping was a reformer at heart. And Deng Xiaoping believed that China needed to reform its economy, that communism was keeping China unnaturally poor. If China was going to ever elevate the living standard of the Chinese people, it was going to have to adopt capitalist reforms, or reforms that made China look a lot more like a capitalist economy. China was going to have to get away from the attitude that was very common in the era of Mao Zedong, that it was somehow un-Chinese, or certainly un-communist, to become rich. And Deng Xiaoping said, no, there's nothing wrong with getting rich. To be rich is a good thing, because people don't get rich by themselves. They get rich by creating jobs and opportunities for other people. So economic reforms began under Deng Xiaoping. And these are probably some of the most important things that have happened in the world economy, in world history, during the period from the 1970s until now. In the 1970s, when these reforms began, China was this very populous country, this country that had lots of people, but it was also a very poor country. The per capita income in China was very low, and millions of Chinese who lived in the countryside were dirt poor. So the reforms set in. And to fast forward, over the last now 40 years, China has gone from being this poor country to being a wealthy country. By now, China has the second largest economy in the world. By some measures, the Chinese economy is even bigger than the American economy. But almost everybody acknowledges that if present trends continue, the Chinese economy will surpass the American economy sometime in the 2020s. Now, this is in gross domestic product, overall production. In per capita income, Chinese incomes still lag far behind American incomes. But when it comes to sort of the throw weight of a country in international affairs, really it's the overall wealth rather than the per capita wealth that is often more important. And I'll come back to this, as I've come back to it again and again. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. In the 1970s, China was a poor country. It could not afford an ambitious foreign policy. by the 21st century, by the 2000s, the 2010s, China had become a wealthy country, a much wealthier country, and it could develop a much more ambitious foreign policy. We're seeing that now. We'll see more in the future of what this leads to. But in the meantime, the United States is trying to figure out, so what to do about this? Should the United States support China's economic evolution? There are some arguments in favor, there's some arguments against. The arguments in favor are, well, China in the 1980s was becoming what some people called the workshop of the world because Chinese wage rates were still quite low, and yet China was reforming economically and building factories. And so people who wanted stuff made in factories could have it made in China, in many cases much cheaper than it could be made in other countries including, say, the United States. So China starting in the 1980s, continuing in the 1990s and the early 2000s, became a place where all sorts of companies, often non-Chinese companies, who wanted to have stuff made in factories would set up factories or form partnerships with factories in China and have their stuff made there. I have a brother. My brother's name is David. He's younger than me, and he went into a family business. And the family business was doing fine. It was a cutlery wholesale and importing business. Cutlery is knives and scissors, things that cut. And a principal product of Coast Cutlery, which was the name of the company, it was based in Portland, Oregon. It was founded by our grandfather, and then run by my dad and my uncle, and then by my brother David. And the company was doing really well, selling, among other things, Swiss Army knives. As some of you will know what Swiss Army knives are, these multi-bladed tools that were very popular among all sorts of people who otherwise never would have carried pocket knives until 9/11. When all of a sudden you couldn't carry this pocket knife onto a plane. And from 2001 until 2002 or 3, when you go to airports, you could see all of these bins where people had to take the Swiss Army knives out of their pockets and hand it over. They wouldn't let anybody on the plane. Well, the bottom fell out of the market for Swiss Army knives. And so David had to figure out, all right, so what else is the company going to make? And the company had been making sort of tentative moves in other directions. And one of the directions that David was taking the country is into making flashlights, in particular LED flashlights. And so we found, okay, this is the time to do it. We really don't have a lot of choice here, and here's an opportunity. And it was a time when LEDs were becoming mass manufactured and pretty cheap. But the trick to making them into flashlights was to provide the lensing, the optics, and not just the LED itself. So he connected with a German engineering or design firm that dealt with the optics and could make the lenses. And they came up with the design and they patented the design. And then David had to figure out, so where are these flashlights going to be made? Okay, well, they'll be made in China, because China by this time had a good reputation for good quality stuff. They could make it quickly and they could make it cheaply. And so David set up an arrangement so that the flashlights were manufactured in China. And this was the way things were working. Now, there was an advantage to Americans. We're speaking of American foreign policy here. There's an advantage to Americans from this, in that Americans could get these products and they could get them at a good price. So David had somebody who could make the business work, make this business model work, and David could sell these flashlights to Americans, and there are good flashlights. You should buy one. Coast flashlights are a very good product, and they're less expensive than they would be if they'd been made in the United States. So that's an advantage. Now, the disadvantage relates to what I just said. They weren't made in the United States. And so there were some jobs that had been done in the United States that moved to China. And moved to other countries. Well, it wasn't just China, where labor was relatively cheap. But China was one where there was a lot of focus on, because people could pay attention to what was going on in China. So there was this question, all right, is China's economic growth good for the United States? And the answer overall, until probably around 2010, was almost always, yeah, it's good for the United States. American consumers get products more cheaply than they would otherwise, good products, more cheaply than they would otherwise. American businesses can form these connections. American manufacturers could hope to sell goods in China as Chinese consumers had more income. So it seemed to be a win-win situation. There were these concerns, though, that jobs were going to China and that maybe in the long run this wouldn't be a good thing. Okay, hold that thought. But related to this question of is China's economic growth, is China's economic development good for the United States, was the question of what's the connection of economic development with political development? Because Americans still had residual worries about China being this communist country. Now, communist in name primarily, it was the Chinese Communist Party. It is the Chinese Communist Party that rules China. And the Communist Party, it wasn't communist as in Marxist economics anymore, but it was communist Leninist in terms of one party governs the whole country. And Americans, as much as they wanted other countries to become more capitalistic, wanted other countries to become more democratic. And the question was, the question that I started this lecture with, is does economic development lead to political development? Does capitalism lead to democracy? And Americans kept telling themselves, yes, it does, it will. Because this is the way it worked in the West, this is the way it worked in the United States. As America became wealthier, it became more democratic. And the hope was, the thinking was, that first of all, China has to solve the poverty problem. And once you lift Chinese people out of poverty into something we'll call the middle class, then once you get sort of the basic necessities of life covered, then people will start to agitate for political reforms. So once you get food on the table, then you start to ask for more freedom. This was the thinking. And it was the hope that this was the way things would work out, because American leaders were not at all sure they wanted to see a wealthy China that was also an authoritarian China, because this gets back to the question of, are democracies less likely to go to war with each other? Autocracies, where it's just a small group of people or one-party rule, they seem to have no compunction about going to war with democracies, and witness World War I and World War II. So, if China's getting wealthier, the hope is China's going to get more democratic, more liberal. But if it's not, that actually might be trouble. So, the experiment, it's an experiment sort of in American thinking, we're watching this take place, how's it going to turn out? It suffered a serious setback in 1989, where there was a pro-democracy movement among Chinese students primarily. And it took place in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, the capital. And these pro-democracy protesters, they wanted more democracy. They wanted elections. They wanted the kind of stuff that American leaders said they wanted for China. And it looked good for a while. Aha, so here's this demand for democracy that American leaders had been hoping was going to follow the economic evolution. And the protests went on for a while, and it was really clear that the protests sort of saw American democracy as the model. There was even a scaled-down version of the Statue of Liberty that was built in Tiananmen Square. But the protests became too threatening for the Chinese government, and the Chinese government cracked down. It sent in the tanks and scattered the protesters, killing hundreds, maybe more than 1,000. Nobody knows, and the Chinese government, in fact, pretty much covered it up, and to this day refuses to talk about it and suppresses any kind of discussion of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But it was a real setback for this thinking that, okay, as China becomes wealthier, it will become more liberal, more democratic. See, no, not at all. But the Bush administration, the administration of the elder George Bush, basically said to itself, okay, democracy doesn't come overnight. And after a reasonable period of arm's length, went back to sort of ordinary business with China. And the U.S. relationship with China went back on track until, through in the early 2000s, the United States helped usher China into the World Trade Organization, basically saying that China is now a fully fledged member of the world economy. And the hope was that as China became tied into the world economy, China would become more like the other major members of the world economy. And this was the hope of the United States. This was American thinking. It has received another setback under the administration of the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, who has become more authoritarian than the Chinese presidents who came before him. And so where are we today? There aren't too many people in the United States and the American foreign policy establishment today who think that the economic evolution of China will by any means inevitably give way to the political evolution of China. But there are people who haven't given up on this. Xi Jinping's not going to live forever, and maybe there is a wave of political reform that will follow. But this is something that any student of modern international relations is watching very closely.